I apologize on my behalf and on behalf of government.
South Africa's President Jacob Zuma survives an impeachment vote in Parliament, but pressure mounts on him to resign. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. South Africa's President Jacob Zuma comfortably survived a drive to impeach him last week. Just 143 of the 400 members of Parliament voted in favor of the motion, with the African National Congress closing ranks behind its embattled leader. Late last month, South Africa's highest court ruled unanimously that President Zuma violated the constitution by failing to repay millions of dollars in state spending for upgrades to his personal residence. It was just the latest controversy surrounding the South African leader. Later, we'll talk with a former spokesperson for the president's cabinet and a leading member of the opposition in Parliament. But we begin in Johannesburg with CCTV's Yolisa Njamela. And Yolisa, after that impeachment vote failed, there have been increasing calls for President Zuma to step down, including from within his own party. How significant is that, and what are the chances that he will in fact resign?
Well, it's actually very significant because President Zuma, for starters, has had a tumultuous time as a president in this country. He's faced scandals, he's faced challenges throughout his presidency, but it's never been like the time that we're experiencing now, knowing that his comrades from within the political party, within the ruling party, the ANC, are calling for his head. They're asking him to resign. Those people include the ANC stalwarts from people like Ahmed Kathrada, who served, or rather served in jail with the former president of this country, the late Nelson Mandela. So it's senior people like that who are asking for Zuma to step down. Churches, businesses, ordinary folk in civil society organizations asking him to step down. But it's actually highly unlikely that President Jacob Zuma will step aside, or at least not now, because you'll know that later this year, this country will be holding the local municipal elections. President Jacob Zuma is extremely popular with the masses, and the ANC will hope that popularity will translate into votes for the party.
Yolisa, let's take a step back here. Take us through the events that led up to this court's ruling and that impeachment vote. How did we get here?
Well, it started off with the renovations at the private home of President Jacob Zuma, a homestead known as Nkandla in this country. He was found by the watchdog to have unduly benefited from public funds. He spent some $60 million renovating his house. When the watchdog of this country asked him or instructed him to pay a portion of that money, he refused, and he was saying the watchdog has no legal powers and therefore her decision is not binding. The opposition parties, which relentless throughout, they took this matter to all kinds of platforms, including the highest court of the land, the Constitutional Court. That is where the Constitutional Court found, amongst other things, that President Jacob Zuma has in fact unduly benefited, and also he failed to uphold the constitution of this country. That was used by the opposition party. It gave them impetus to go to parliament and try to impeach the president. Well, they failed dismally, because you would know in this country, the African National Congress, the ruling party, have more numbers than all opposition parties combined.
Thanks, Yolisa. That's CCTV's Yolisa Njamela reporting from Johannesburg. Joining us now from Cape Town is John Steenhuisen. He's a member of South Africa's Parliament and the Chief Whip of the Democratic Alliance. With us from Johannesburg is Mzwanele Manyi. He previously served in the Zuma administration as spokesperson for the President's Cabinet and Chief Executive Officer of the Government Communication and Information System. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Mzwanele, as we just heard from our reporter there, President Jacob Zuma was found to have violated the Constitution of South Africa when he failed to repay money that was used for improvements to his private residence. That's just the latest controversy that he's been involved in. In the past, he's been accused of rape, he's been accused of corruption, there have been some highly questionable decisions on cabinet appointments and dismissals. Should he remain president of South Africa?
Definitely, yes. I think a lot of people are confused. What you've just summarized now is not actually what actually has happened. A lot of people keep confusing the judgment of the Constitutional Court. The judgment is very clear that the actual primary offense here is the issue of not respecting, so to speak, the binding powers of the public protector. And then consequentially, then it impacts on the constitutionality of that act, as opposed to a direct act, as it were, of violating the Constitution. The word, the sentence violate the Constitution, it's not contained in that judgment. So the president, the judgment is very clear that the president acted inconsistent with that particular provision. What people now are doing in this country, which is not correct, they think that this judgment is an omnibus for everything that they don't like about the president. They put corruption charges, they put all kinds of things that are not in the judgment. All of those things have got separate processes. This judgment, people must be very clear, this judgment is not an omnibus for all the ills of this country. It was purely about clarifying, providing legal certainty about the powers of the public protector, which the Constitutional Court has done. And the Constitutional Court has actually issued 11 orders to remedy the situation, so that the president has welcomed unreservedly. So the president of this country, a very humble man, has agreed to subject himself to the highest court of this land as orders, as it were. The opposition parties, who are not law-abiding, they did not want to accept all the orders as given. They decided by themselves that this inconsistency amounts to serious misconduct, amounts to serious violation, a language which is not contained in the court order. And as a result of that, they've gone on to Parliament to try and vote out the president. And indeed, that process was allowed because members of Parliament in South Africa respect the law. Okay. They respect the opposition's views, even if they are wrong. But the final position on that was that the president was voted back into office, so to speak, by a democratically done process. So we should be moving on, but still, even after that process, the opposition continues to want to roam around the street and bring down the confidence of South Africa in terms of views by international investors. It's quite an irresponsible behavior by the opposition party.
All right, let me go to John. John, we're hearing there from a supporter of Jacob Zuma that this is not as serious as it's being made out, that President Zuma did make some mistakes, but they're not as serious as we're making out.
Well, I think that's Mr. Mani's impression of the matter, and I mean, one wouldn't expect anything different from him. Unfortunately, much like he failed to convince his own ANC branch, he doesn't convince the opposition and certainly doesn't convince the South African public. The Constitutional Court was very clear. It said that the President had failed to uphold the Constitution and had acted in an unlawful manner when he failed to implement the remedial actions that the public protector laid out. What Mr. Mani doesn't say is that the President has put South Africa through 6 years of political turmoil in his bid to try and exonerate himself and prevent himself from having to do the honourable thing and pay the money that he owed for the non-security upgrades to his private residence. The Constitutional Court couldn't have been more explicit that the President had failed to uphold the Constitution and had violated the law of the Republic of South Africa. And Section 89 of the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa couldn't have been more explicit, that when the President fails to uphold his oath of office, the Constitution and the laws of the Republic, that he must then be subjected to, or open himself up for a challenge in terms of being removed from office. I don't think that the Constitutional Court and the watershed nature of the judgment can simply be brushed off in the manner that Mr. Mani has said. It is a very serious matter. It's the most serious indictment of a sitting president. And as head of the executive, he should be setting the example to the rest of his cabinet. Clearly, he has failed to do so, and he should no longer serve as the head of state in South Africa and president of the Republic of South Africa. It's simply not good enough to say that he is a humble man. He's not a humble man. Even his what's so-called apology was not an apology. He said,
Right.
apologize for the confusion and misunderstanding. He manufactured that confusion and misunderstanding over the last 6 years. There was not an apology, not a humble man, and unfortunately, it's simply not good enough.
Okay, let's bring in Sipho Sepe. He's a columnist and associate political editor for South Africa's oldest web-based news source and Africa's first online newspaper, The Mail and Guardian. He joins us from Johannesburg. And Sipho, what exactly is the legal impact of this constitutional court ruling? Did the court just say, President Zuma, you're going to have to pay the money back, or was there any other kind of legal sanction against the president in South Africa?
I think we are living in a constitutional democracy, and the parties have a right to exploit every opportunity that comes to make sure that their fortunes become better. And in this case, as Jimmy Manye indicates, that there was a clear issue of misunderstanding or what they call error in law. And it is also correct that the president could have taken a different position of simply paying back the money, but he didn't. But the long and short of it is that the matter ultimately was taken to the Constitutional Court. And the court made a determination. And the language was very strong to say he had failed to uphold and defend and respect the Constitution. And of course, the opposition parties, as they would and probably as they must, began to say, but let us test this in, as the Constitution suggests, that where there is a transgression by a head of state, the National Assembly may remove a sitting president. And they went that route. So I don't think we should actually fault them for exercising and trying to exploit every opportunity that comes. But ultimately, whether a sitting president is fit for purpose or that will be determined by the people. And Parliament represents the people. And ultimately, the matter went to Parliament and the opposition was defeated.
Okay, let's step away from the letter of the law for a moment. Let's look at the political fallout here. Mzonele, there are a number of factions within the ruling African National Congress that want President Zuma to step down, and these factions include highly respected veterans of the movement in South Africa. They also include some provincial branches of that party in South Africa. Is the president listening to what his members are saying?
Yeah, a couple of things. First, I think I'm happy that Mr. Steenhuisen makes mention of Section 89. That section is actually a proper section to talk about, which talks about the removal of the president. What is very, very clear on this judgment, that section is not even referred to anywhere in the judgment. And in terms of Section 172 of the Constitution, the Concord has got a duty and an obligation. The word used there is must. If there's anything inconsistent, whatever clause that has been inconsistent with must be referenced, must be declared unconstitutional. That Section 89, had the Constitutional Court mentioned Section 89, wouldn't be having this discussion. It would be very clear, and it would be contrary to the oath of office of MPs to vote otherwise. The reason MPs vote the way they did is because the Constitutional Court was doing its routine task. It's almost, let me just complete, it's almost like a law that is not constitutional. This is in that same realm that when you strike a law and say it's unconstitutional, you can't then say people must be fired.
Okay, look, I mean, you're talking about the letter of the law here. Let's move to the broad picture here. You know, do you think that damage has been done to South Africa's image and reputation by the president's actions? I mean, we see it here in the media. We see it in media in other parts of the world.
I think the important thing to note here is that the overwhelming majority of the people of this country have got full confidence in this government that is led by the ANC. The issue of whether the president has created damage or not is an issue that cannot be left to opposition parties to pronounce on. This opposition party, for the past 2 years, they've been raising motion of no confidence. All they want is to be in power. So they do not want to respect the will of the people as expressed by Parliament. So we can't operate with people like this that have got a superiority complex. This is what we're facing here. We've got people who've got a superiority complex who think that everything that they say and do must go.
Okay, that criticism of the president, I should say, is not just confined to the South African opposition. We've heard criticism most recently from some very influential newspapers and magazines, The Economist, The Financial Times, The New York Times. Bloomberg has just said that South Africa cannot prosper under the current president. John, what are the legal options now to remove the president?
We'll get to that, but I also just want to say that I noticed Mr. Mani very deftly sidestepped the internal ructions within his own party as a result of the president's action. This is spilling over into the public arena on a daily basis. You've got branches, you've got provincial executives, all turning on President Zuma, realizing the ANC itself, with many of its branches, what a liability the president is. In terms of options going forward, we have a constitutional democracy. We didn't have a democracy that allowed for a tyranny of the majority. I believe that Section 89 of the Constitution is very clear. The truth of the matter is the Constitutional Court was never going to rule that the president must step down, because that would be overstepping their boundary in terms of the separation of powers. But the language that they used and the manner in which they couched their judgment was unambiguous, that the president had failed to uphold the Constitution and had acted in an unlawful manner, clearly meeting the prescripts of Section 89 of the Constitution. And however Mr. Mani wants to spin that, that is the language that was used. And so there are a number of options we are going to use going forward. But chief amongst these is mobilizing South African civil society and South African voters across the spectrum to send a very strong message to the African National Congress in the coming local government elections. Mr. Mani says that the ANC enjoys the full, and President Zuma enjoys the full support of the South African public. Well, that's untested yet. The local government elections coming up later this year provide a perfect referendum for ordinary South Africans to express themselves on the misconduct of the president and his unsuitability for office. And if the ANC want to tough it out with him as president, we in the opposition say bring it on. You couldn't create a more perfect environment for us to head into an election with a lame duck president who's been constitutionally exposed by the highest court in the land.
Okay, we are going to have to take a break right now. More of our conversation after that. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back. We're talking about the political challenges facing South African President Jacob Zuma. Let's get back to our panel. Sipho, let me start with you this time. Of course, there is a legal case to be made against the President of South Africa, but there is also a moral one. There is a political one as well. And I want to read to you something that the former Deputy Secretary General of the ANC, Cheryl Carolus, said on a South African radio station just a few days ago. She said, having sex with a child who grew up in front of him was supposedly an error of judgment. His friendship with various people who went to prison was an error of judgment. Nkandla was an error of judgment. Nkandla is the name of the residence where these improvements were made. And she went on to say that we should not default to such undignified behavior. Let's get some integrity back into the game. That is quite a statement, Sipho, coming from a very senior member of the ANC, the ruling party, President Zuma's party.
No, that's correct. But also, you must also factor that there are also many members who were senior in the ANC and who are senior in the ANC who support the president. What we need to accept here is that there are people who are opposed to the president and there are people who are not opposed to the president. What ultimately matters in politics is what are the numbers? Is the president, does he still enjoy the support of majority or not? What you often find is that you'll find in the media there'll be mention of individuals, but at the same time you'll also see the same media covering the president going to stadiums that are filled to capacity where the people who are there show a lot of support. Ultimately, what the ANC will determine is to what extent is there a political cost to this. But what cannot be gainsaid is that there has been a political cost. But how far has that cost been? But to then assume that the president has lost support, it's something that some of us simply express as wishes. but we do not have the numbers on the ground. But the numbers that we see, and it is what I see, are individuals of stature coming out, but I also see thousands of people who rally behind the president.
Right.
Even when it comes to provinces, you have a province like Gauteng, which has taken a position, but you also have other provinces that they're taking exactly the opposite position. So this is a contestation, and we must accept it. And also, in the best of times, the ANC is never united.
Right.
It is made of a number of factions. So at any one time, there'll be disagreements.
Okay. Mzwanela, about the ANC being united, there we heard from Sipho telling us that there are elements within the party that support the president. There are elements that oppose the president. Is the ANC a divided party? Has unity been lost?
No, ANC is a very democratic party. It's a very democratic organization. What happens in the ANC, there are always robust engagements and robust debates. Now, people almost confuse these robust engagements with debates as divisions. And just to show that the ANC is united, that when there's robust engagements, that does not mean it's divisions. The opposition party mistakes that for division. And although they are just a paltry party of some 22% party, but they have the energy to come and want to stage a vote in parliament because they believe in their own propaganda that the ANC is so divided that members of the ANC are going to vote with them. And every time they get defeated with the understanding of divisions which are imaginary.
Okay.
Lastly, I think it's disingenuous for Mr. Steenhuisen to say that Section 89 is applicable. The court would have said so if that was the case. The Section 172 compels the court to pronounce as such. Absence of that in the judgment is very, 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 very fundamental. The president of this country is a constitutional being.
Yep.
Every step of the way is constitutional. It can't be that every mistake is fatal. This is why you've got Section 89. The other things the other remedies are there to deal with other mistakes. But if a mistake is fatal, the court will declare Section 89. It will still not instruct Parliament. It will declare that this section has not been complied with, and then Parliament will vote on their consciences on that basis. It will not instruct them, but it will declare that it's not been complied with.
Okay,
so it mustn't be disingenuous here.
All right, I want to move on now. John, after that Constitutional Court ruled unanimously against President Zuma, he spoke to the South African people. Let's take a listen to some of what he had to say.
I wish to emphasize that I never knowingly or deliberately set out to violate the Constitution. The intention was not in pursuit of corrupt ends or to use state resources to unduly benefit me and my family. With hindsight, there are many matters that could have been handled differently, which we deeply regret.
So, John, the President of South Africa, they're saying that he deeply regrets what happened. He's very sorry. Is that acceptable?
Well, it's not acceptable because he hasn't made a fulsome apology to the people of South Africa. As I said, if you listen on to the clip, he goes on to apologize for, quote, the misunderstanding, quote, confusion was created around this issue. He was the architect of that misunderstanding and the architect of that confusion. This is a man who's had 246 million rand of South African public money spent on his private residence for the installation of items like swimming pools, air conditioning, cattle kraals, and a whole host of other luxurious add-ons. That is not the behavior of someone who's charged with constitutional obligations to govern according to the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa. The Constitutional Court was explicit. No matter what Mr. Mani says or how he tries to spin it, that the president failed to uphold the Constitution and acted in an unlawful manner. You can't get away from that. And, you know, frankly, Mr. Money's also confused. We didn't bring the motion of impeachment against the president expecting the ANC to vote against their president. We brought it precisely because we wanted to show South Africa that the African National Congress puts their loyalty to President Zuma above the Constitution and above the people that sent them there. That was the reason that the motion was brought to the floor. We knew that the African National Congress members of Parliament don't have the guts, because of the political system in South Africa, to actually make a stand according to their real conscience. I know that there are a number of my colleagues in Parliament on the other side of the aisle that abhor what the President has done and are revolted by the excesses of his administration, yet they are afraid to lose their seats because of the system in South Africa and didn't dare vote against the African National Congress. It's also worth noting that in that morning caucus of the African National Congress, ANC MPs were warned that if they voted against the president, they would lose their seats in Parliament. This isn't the behavior of a party that's assured of massive support internally and a cohesive unit inside the African National Congress. It's a behavior of a party that's terrified to allow their members a free vote on the matter because they know what could happen.
Right, Sipho, I've just got a few seconds left. The ANC will be tested at the ballot box in August. The president has announced that local elections will take place in South Africa on August the 3rd. This is going to be the first electoral test. What do you think is going to happen?
Well, I think what is going to happen is that the ANC is going to go out and try to talk to the people and explain themselves. But what is most important is even if the president were to be found to be guilty and has been found guilty and the people were to agree that he's guilty, what determines the vote is not one incident. What they look at is a compendium of issues, whether the ANC is still a party that carries their aspiration and their hopes. And that is what is going to determine how they're going to vote. And most importantly, if you look on the ground, when people go on protest, you don't see them protesting against the president. They protest against the failure or on the failure of the government to deliver services. We have had a number of protests, about 1,000 protests or more than that.
Okay.
But the issue has always been about what's in it for them. It has not been about Jacob Zuma. And I think the ANC will try to emphasize that aspect, to say we are still the custodian of your aspirations and your hopes.
Okay, gentlemen, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.